But first I'll introduce myself. I am Anne-Marie Worth-Cushan, and I am the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Stillpoint Magazine. So Stillpoint Magazine, one of your hosts, we publish critical theory and psychoanalytic essays and literature, and we curate contemporary visual art, emphasizing those who have been historically marginalized in psychoanalysis and academia. We exist in public digital spaces intentionally outside of institutions that have reinforced those marginalizations historically. And we foster anti-racist liberation praxis through psychoanalytic thinking and the arts. One of the ways we do this is by featuring Indigenous artists and writers and scholars under the guidance of our elder in residence, Tanaka Yago. Sorry, I'm nervous. Stillpoint Magazine is located on Dakota land. And if you'd like to support the land back movement so that this isn't just an empty land acknowledgement, I'll put a link in the chat where you can donate. Here we go. And with that, I will hand it to Bridget, and you can talk a little bit about MPSI.
I just want to welcome everyone and thank you for coming today. I'm really excited about this event. MPSI is the Minnesota Psychoanalytic Society and Institute, and I'm the society president. MPSI is a nonprofit, volunteer-led organization that's based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Our mission is to provide psychoanalytically informed educational services and to promote collegial affiliation within our membership and the community. And it's a volunteer-led organization, and so we really want to encourage people to join and participate, and that's what keeps this organization going. And so we can offer things like we're offering today. And so it's made up of a couple of different parts. There's the Minnesota Psychoanalytic Institute, which houses our psychoanalytic training program. And then the society houses a couple of different things. We have a psychodynamic psychotherapy training program, an advanced clinical seminar. And then we have a fellowship program that goes through the MPSI Psychotherapy Center, which is a low-fee clinic that offers low-fee, psychodynamically oriented psychotherapy to people who otherwise couldn't afford it. They're typically underinsured or uninsured people from low-income households. And so it's a great organization. We're doing a lot of really good things. This event is something I've really been looking forward to myself. I'm a volunteer in this role as president, and then in my full-time job, I work as a fire captain and psychotherapist with Minneapolis Fire Department. So I'm a big feminist supporter, and I'm really excited about today. I want to thank everyone involved. So that's it.
Cool. So before we begin the conversation, I'll introduce our interlocutors. We have Kate Novack, writer, director, and producer of documentary films. She wrote and produced Page One inside the New York Times about the paper's former media columnist, David Carr, and The Crisis in Print Journalism, which was nominated for 2 Emmy Awards and a Critics' Choice Award. In 2018, Kate directed and produced The Gospel According to Andre, which was recognized as one of the best LGBTQ documentaries of the year by the Society of LGBTQ Entertainment Critics. Her most recent film, Hysterical Girl, about the legacy of Freud's Dora case, which we're discussing today, was nominated for Best Short by the International Documentary Association and shortlisted for an Academy Award. Many congratulations on both of those. Reviewing the film for the New Yorker, Richard Brody called it extraordinary, a feature's worth of ideas, emotions, allusions, references, and associations condensed into a mere 13 minutes. And Kate started her career as a print journalist at Time Magazine. So welcome, Kate. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks, Anne-Marie.
And Kate is joined by Madelon Sprengnether, who is a Regents Professor Emerita of the Department of English at the University of Minnesota, where we both are located, where she taught literature and founded the MFA program in creative writing, which I did not know, Madelon. That's way cool. She's a scholar of Shakespeare as well as a feminist psychoanalytic critic. Her publications include The Mother Tongue, Essays in Feminist Psychoanalytic Interpretation, The Spectral Mother, Freud, Feminism, and Psychoanalysis, Changing the Word and the World, Essays in Feminist Criticism, and Shakespearean Tragedy and Gender. She's also a writer of poetry and memoir. Her most recent books include Near Solstice, prose poems, Great River Road, Memoir and Memory, and Mourning Freud, which came out in 2018. Psychoanalyst Thomas Ogden has described Mourning Freud as a beautifully written book in which Sprengnether respectfully, intelligently develops penetrating critiques of Freud's work, particularly in the areas of pre-Oedipal development, mourning, and female psychology, which is part of why we're here today. This event was Madelon's brainchild. So thank you so much, Madelon, for bringing all of these lovely people together. And I can't wait to hear what you both have to discuss. So I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you. And first of all, I want to thank MPSI and Stillpoint for making this event possible and for the collaboration that you brought about, and through the wonders of Zoom, we can have an international audience, which is awesome. Really, truly awesome. I want to begin by talking a little bit about how Kate and I met, and that will lead into my first question. We encountered each other in the winter of 2019, which now seems like eons ago, given the intervention of COVID, at the annual meeting of the American Psychoanalytic Association, where she came to film the discussion group that I was participating in at that time. And the title of that group is The History of Psychoanalysis. After that event, after the discussion group, we got into a conversation and then decided to continue talking a little bit later. So the film Hysterical Girl has long, deep roots, I would say, but it was also sparked by that meeting. So I want to begin by asking Kate, how did the idea for this film begin? You say somewhere in an interview that I read that you had long thought about making a film about Freud. How did it come together around the Dora case history? And what was the significance of that meeting for you, if it helped generate or bring everything together as you began to actually make the film?
Yeah. Well, Madelon, first of all, thank you so much for putting this event together, and to MPSI and Stillpoint. I'm excited for the conversation. So it's true that it sort of had deep roots. I first read the Dora case in a first year English seminar in college, and was very kind of taken with it. This was in the mid-90s. I don't remember being bothered in any way by sort of the way that Freud approached the case or the questions that he asked Dora, which kind of disturbs me today, that I didn't focus on that. I really was thinking about the novelistic qualities of his writing and the nonlinearity of that case history. But it stayed with me. And then the idea of a film about Freud really kind of, continued to grow in my own therapy. I was in psychotherapy with a therapist who I wasn't in analysis, but he had trained as an analyst. And so we would sort of, I don't know if he was supposed to do this, but he would make tea for us, and we would discuss the possibility of a film, of my making a film related to Freud in some way. But it never really, the sort of story never really clicked. Like, what was the story that felt the most urgent to me? And so I sort of went on with my career. I was working on other projects, but over the years, I would go back and, reread or read Freud's writings, read the various biographies on him. And it was around the time of the Kavanaugh hearings that I went and reread the Dora case. And the sort of the similarities between the Christine Blasey Ford's testimony, and Brett Kavanaugh's appearance at those hearings, there were so many similarities between that and the Dora case. And it just felt, that was like a sort of a light bulb moment. But from there, I still was kind of finding my way. It really was conceived as a feature film, as a 90-minute feature film that would include interviews, that might include some, verite material with analysts. And so that led me to, the APSA convention in 2019. It was about, 5 months after the Kavanaugh hearings. And the topic of your history panel was the missing mother. And I had read your book, Mourning Freud, and I was very interested in panels that dealt with gender and sexuality within, Freud's writings and the history of Freud. So that was a very interesting panel. I really went there also because I wanted to meet you. So it wasn't complete just coincidence that we then ended up speaking. I really wanted that to happen. So, we spoke after, and we had a pretty wide-ranging conversation. And then we started talking about the Dora case. And you said, Christine Blasey Ford would be the Dora would be the Christine Blasey Ford of her time. And that really crystallized everything. And, so you played a very big role in the kind of direction that the film then took.
This is so fascinating to me, because we really haven't talked at length since I met you 2 years ago. And a lot of the things that you said, I did not know. There are more parallels between our histories than I ever would have imagined, especially given the difference in our ages. I'm like your mom. I first read the Dora case history when I was in college, though it wasn't being taught in a seminar of any kind. And it interests me that you read it in an English seminar, English literature seminar, and maybe we can pursue that later. But I wanted wisdom. I was all about truth and wisdom when I was an undergraduate in college in the 60s. I read the case history thinking I was going to learn something deep and significant about myself. It didn't happen, so I just put it aside. And when I came back to psychoanalysis, or psychoanalytic thinking and psychoanalytic theory, it was in the 70s when I was in psychotherapy. And I was in therapy with someone who was psychoanalytically trained, but not, I would say, a Freudian. And I began reading theory from a very different angle, because I had a friend who recommended that I read D.W. Winnicott. Mm-hmm. And that's really where I began. And I loved Winnicott. I just read everything I could get my hands on. I also had a very young daughter at the time. who is about, a toddler. And so everything I read in Winnicott, I could see happening in my relationship with my daughter and her development. When I came back to Freud, it was much later. And when I read the Dora case history again, it just seemed peculiar to me. And I ended up writing an essay about it in the 1980s, which was a kind of a heyday of feminism and feminist thinking and critique, and especially critique of the Dora case history, which lends itself to many different types of interpretation because it is so literary in a sense. That kind of brings us back to Stephen Marcus's comment about that case history as reading like a modernist novel. And he even described Freud as an unreliable narrator. In any case, I'm very fascinated by all of these parallels that are emerging for me just now as we talk, because I had also been very wrapped up in the Kavanaugh hearings. And I had actually thought about writing a blog about Christine Blasey Ford and why her testimony was so discredited. So that was why the subject came up when we talked. And it seems like our thinking converged at that point in time. But I want to talk a little bit further, before we get back to Freud and Dora, I'd like to talk more about the kind of research you did before engaging in this film. You said in an interview that you actually went to the Library of Congress or looked them up online and read interviews with members of her family. And so I'm fascinated by that. Could you say more?
Yeah, absolutely. So I went to the Library of Congress, and then I went online, and a lot of their materials in the Freud archives are digitized. And there are a series of interviews that Kurt Eisler conducted in the founder of the Freud archives, conducted in the 1950s with kind of Freud's surviving circle. And among those interviews were transcripts of discussions with, a cousin of Dora's who was her age, a couple of uncles, and then Herr K, or Hans Zelenka's son, Otto. And that one was really interesting. And, the sort of portrait that they painted of Ida, to give her back her real name, was so different from Freud's. Freud really seemed to kind of not like her very much and not have much appreciation for someone who is described, by Otto and by her cousin Elsa as kind of being sarcastic and having a sharp wit and a very curious, determined young woman. And so that was the sort of the starting point of the research. Was really, I wanted to understand as best I could who Ida was, not through Freud's eyes. So it also turned up even factual inaccuracies in the case. So for example, he frequently gets her age wrong. And he says that she was 14 at the time of the first assault. And she was 13. If you look at her birth date and the kind of when things happened over the summer, just before she turned 14. And so, that was really interesting. And then late in the research, I think we were already in the edit, a young researcher who was working with me discovered that her great granddaughter had written a historical novel about Ida in German. And so that kind of became, and it also helped fill out the portrait of her, which obviously it was, Katerina, her great-granddaughter, imagining her great-grandmother, but it similarly was in contrast with Freud's portrait. So, yeah.
That is truly amazing. I did not know that those interviews were in the Freud archives, much less what's in the interviews themselves. So one thought I'm having is maybe it's time for another take on that case history. I don't know that many people have examined it, re-examined it recently.
Yeah.
But in light of this new information, it maybe calls for another look.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe this would be the moment to say a few things about the case history for those participants who are not familiar with it. And I'll try to boil it down very radically because there are many lines that Freud pursues that don't fit into this summary or the way I'm going to present it. But in essence, Ida's father brought her to Freud for analysis because of her so-called hysterical symptoms. She was having, evidently, according to Freud, a nervous cough. She sometimes lost her voice. She had episodes of depression, gastric pains, and an occasional limp. Those are the symptoms that Freud describes. Ida's father, interestingly, knew Freud, and he had been in treatment with him for syphilis, of all things. So they had a relationship prior to Ida's beginning analysis with Freud. Her story, which Freud actually credited, is that her father's friend, Herke, had assaulted her when she was, Freud says 14, you point out that she was actually 13, by grabbing her and kissing her. She felt repelled by that, pushed him away and left. 2 years later, he actually propositioned her at a kind of isolated setting on a lake where the two families were vacationing together. In the background, her father was having an affair with Herke's wife, called Frauke in the case history. And Herke evidently felt he could get something out of Dora, that she might respond to him. Dora was incensed by all of this. She didn't think her father should be having an affair with Frauke. She certainly did not want to succumb to the advances of Herke. When she complained to her father about this, he denied her allegations that he was having an affair, and Herke denied her allegations that he had approached her in an inappropriate way. Once she unfolded the story, Freud agreed with her, which was the upside of the analysis, I suppose. On the other hand, he tried to persuade her that she actually was aroused by Herke and appreciated his advances, was in love with him, and presumably even wanted him sexually. He went on to claim that she was in love with her father and that she was in love with Frauke, which complicates the story considerably. The part of it that is most disturbing is that he seemed to imply that if Dora had given in to Herke, that would have solved a lot of problems for everyone. In other words, her father could go on with his affair with Frauke, and Herke would feel satisfied because his wife was preoccupied elsewhere. He would have his own partner in this young girl. This leaves the mother out of the picture entirely, Ida's mother, of course, and that's another story. Ida Bauer finally left analysis rather abruptly, and Freud was very distressed by this because he felt that he was making progress in his treatment and wanted to complete it on his own terms. He wrote up the case history immediately after her analysis, but he did not publish it for another 5 years. Freud himself was 40 at this moment in time, 40 years old, about the same age as Ida's father and Herr K. And he regarded Herr K as a rather attractive man. So there's a lot of uncomfortable lines of association here. That's the story in summary. There's much more that can be unfolded from it, but I think it's important to put that out there. I think most people who read this case history today feel extremely uncomfortable, if not as repelled as Dora was. I want to kind of segue now back to your film because that is the focus of our discussion. And I wondered if you could talk more about how you put it all together, because you moved from Dora, and Christine Blasey Ford does appear briefly in your film, but also to the Me Too movement. So I wonder if you could just talk more about that side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I had mentioned that I originally contemplated the film as a 90-minute feature film. And as I was doing more and more research, there were so many examples of these kind of tropes that were, in the Dora case, that were in the Kavanaugh hearings, that were, in the Anita Hill testimony. It's even more pronounced. They just kept reappearing across time periods, across different media, art forms. And so I was in the car with my producer, and, I said, I really, if I could do this film in any way, I would just juxtapose all of these, this with the Freud case. And so we kind of said in that moment, okay, what would that look like? What would that mean? And we decided then, let's do this as a short, because it freed me up to experiment more. Not that one can't experiment in a feature film, of course you can, but it's a little bit easier to do in a short form. And so that was sort of, everything kind of came together then. And I really set out to create a script. It started with, after the research into Ida Bauer that we just talked about, I started with a script and really taking the case history, which, as you said, is complicated and serpentine. There are 2 dreams in it that are analyzed, and distilling it to a form that could work in a short film and would not represent, the entire case, but would be true to its essence, or at least to the part of its essence that the film was going to address, which was really, Freud's reaction to, basically blaming Dora for being assaulted by this older man, and kind of putting the burden on her for not responding to his, harassment and assault. And so I really, so I worked on the script, and that was one of the hardest parts of the process, to take that case history and distill it. Like I said, I created a script that addressed both dreams, but it felt like once I tiptoed into trying to in any way deal with the case in an exhaustive, comprehensive way, it was just not going to work. Like, that to me is a 10-year endeavor. Like, it is just so much more complicated to do that. And so there was the script, and there was the putting the script in the words of a girl young woman today, which actually wasn't that difficult. Once I had a feel for who Dora was through like the eyes of some of her contemporaries, it was much easier to do that and to kind of create this Dora character who was rooted in the present day. So there was the scripting, but then I really tried to approach it in a visual way. And so at my workspace, I had kind of a picture of Dora next to a picture of Anita Hill, next to a picture of Christine Blasey Ford. And I had, you know, John Baldessari art next to Joseph Hoffman, Vienna workshops, like postcards of some of his interiors, and just to try to create this visual space that also melded time periods and media. So that was, I don't know, does that answer the question?
Yes, and it leads me into many more trains of thought. I want to hold on to one of them to pull out of what you just said. I think at the heart of your film, one thing it gets to very immediately, or with great immediacy, is the utter inappropriateness of a man in his 40s grabbing a girl of 13 and kissing her, and 2 years later suggesting that they go to bed together. This to us today is shocking. And at the same time, we are now hearing more from women to whom this has happened. And one thing I was thinking about as you were talking is how recently, actually, the notion of sexual harassment has come into our common vocabulary. And I did some checking back on dates for this because I wanted to be sure I'd gotten them accurately. The term sexual harassment really came into discourse in this country in the mid-1970s. Think about that. Before that, it was hard to name this behavior because there was no way to describe it. And when I think back to my own experience, I was in my late 20s in the 1970s. And in my first employment, sexual harassment was routine. It just happened all of the time. And my colleagues and I, women colleagues and I, just ignored it or dismissed it. Now, I wouldn't say anything as egregious as what happened to Dora happened to me in the workplace. And certainly, as these stories come out from other women, it did happen to them. If you think about Harvey Weinstein's behavior. But we didn't have a language for what was happening to us in the 70s. So we had no way to complain about it. And even if we had, it wouldn't have gone anywhere. There wasn't any way we could bring a lawsuit, for instance, because it wasn't in the legal system. And that didn't come about until, let me just check my notes here. Well, rape and sexual assault were prohibited by civil statute as part of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So that's rape and sexual assault, but not sexual harassment, which wasn't really a matter that you could file a legal complaint against until 1980. So think about that. I think that your film really pulls all of this information together in a very dramatic way and a very succinct way, and by using imagery rather than argument. You know, it's sometimes very complex to make a statement that is persuasive in words, and you have done it in images, which is, I think, extremely powerful. The clips that you use in rapid succession make your point. So I wanted to just focus on that for a moment, but also, I'll just throw a couple of other dates out there. The term Me Too was coined in 2006 by civil rights activist Tarana Burke, but it didn't really go viral until 2017 when the allegations about Weinstein came out because they were so voluminous and so credible. And he, of course, was indicted for them and is serving time in prison as we speak. So these things that were happening to women historically were not a part of public discourse because there wasn't a language for them and there weren't statutes that prohibited them in the workplace or elsewhere. I want to pursue another line of thought about your film, though, that has to do with the woman you chose to play the part of Dora. And I wonder if you could talk some more about her and maybe also the connection with Katarina Adler's novel, which I haven't read, called Ida, which fascinates me that she has done that.
Yeah, well, I may sort of jump back a little bit to what I was saying sort of before you asked that question. I feel like reading the Dora case history today, it's kind of like awful. And so it's pretty easy to see the fault in Freud in 2021. But in a way that isn't what the movie is meant to do. It maybe does do that a bit, but the purpose of the film is really to hold a mirror to the current moment. Mm-hmm. You know, and I think when you describe this timeline and how things are really, you know, they're changed, it's pretty recent that things have started to, you know, we've even had the term sexual harassment, as you point out. So yeah, it's really, I hope that the movie can communicate visually that we have a foot in 1900 and we have a foot in 2020, and we need to kind of like take the foot out of 1900 and bring it into the current moment. And then, you know, I'm glad you asked about Tommy Vines as the young actor who plays Dora. And, you know, first and foremost, Dora, Ida Bauer, was a victim of sexual assault. Before she was Freud's patient, before she became a source of, you know, study and a subject of study and reinterpretation, she was a 13-year-old girl who was a victim of sexual assault by, you know, a man in his 40s. And so it was important to me that the film, that she owned the screen. I wanted the Dora character to really kind of be able to stand up to this swirl of imagery and this swirl of, you know, almost like stream of consciousness type of editing, and not get lost. And I had these great, you know, really cinematic, intimate home movies of Freud that are in the film. And I was worried that those would sort of he would eclipse her as a character, and that would kind of be a disaster. So, you know, I didn't know for sure that I would use an actor who would appear on screen. I contemplated having the Dora character also be like a voice actor. But so Tommy Vines was 16 at the time that we filmed, you know, which is pretty unusual. Usually if you're, you know, filming a child, you usually will cast older. But she came in for her part and she was so self-possessed and so mature, but she also had a bit of an innocence about her that really just like captured, we all really wanted her to play the part. And, you know, she and I spent a lot of time talking about the role and sort of what it meant to her as a, you know, 16-year-old girl living in New York City in 2020. And I think she felt like it was a part that she could really slip into, because it was so many, you know, of the same questions and issues and kind of thought patterns that she feels like she faces in her own experience. So she was really terrific to work with. And, you know, but the way that she's framed, the way that she's shot, it all really is geared toward allowing her to hold the screen and really intercutting, like kind of match framing between her and Anita Hill and Christine Blasey Ford, so that you start to feel the connection between these three women. And then, so you had also asked about the Katarina Adler book. And I discovered that, as I said, sort of late in the process, but it did really make it feel natural to imagine the Dora character as a girl today, because Katarina's description of Ida Bauer, you know, like she describes the feeling that Ida had when she left Freud's for the last time and kind of, you know, exerted the only power that she really had, which was to quit and walk out. So it gave us as the filmmaking team, I think, sort of confidence in, you know, experimenting with placing her in today's times, but also intercutting that with Freud's being in 1900.
Yes, I think that from my point of view, when I first saw the film, I think that Tommy anchors it. Without her, the film would be quite different. She holds everything together, the past and the present. And I want to go back for a moment to Freud to put some of the Dora case history in context in terms of his career. He had just published The Interpretation of Dreams, so he was at the very outset of a venture that was entirely new, that he invented psychoanalysis, the discipline of psychoanalysis, which has now branched out in many different directions. And at that time, he was very committed to the notion that every neurosis has a psychosexual origin. So he came to his treatment of Dora with that in mind, and I think he wanted to find that. And I think that's one of the things a reader of today feels, that he needs to prove his own theory. Unfortunately, he just imposed it on Dora, and it feels in a coercive way to us today. But that was one of the presumptions he had when he began to treat her. The other one was that he was, of course, committed to the notion of dream interpretation, because he just published this monumental book. So he wanted to use her treatment as a way of demonstrating the significance of dream interpretation. So I think he brought those two predispositions to whatever Dora brought to him. And he wrote the case history in order to demonstrate that he was right, essentially. But that's also what comes across to us as enforcing his point of view and not really quite listening to her. So I wanted to just go back in time, as you did, that we have 1 foot in 1900 and 1 foot in 2021. And there's a big difference between then and now, fortunately for women. I mean, we weren't really quite part of the picture then. And one of the things that I thought about over time is how little Freud thought about not only women, but mothers. He really, he was focused on fathers. And you also feel that in the case history, that the men loom large, but Dora's mother hardly exists. And Frau K's role as a mother of children is not a matter of consideration at all. So coming back into the present, having completed the film and having some distance from it now, where does it lead you? And what are your thoughts about what you're going to do next?
So I am developing a film about Benjamin Spock.
Really?
Yes. So we have to talk again.
Tell us why. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, it came out of the research that I did, for this project, because he was the first American pediatrician. Spock was the first American pediatrician to train as a psychoanalyst, and really brought a lot of those ideas into pediatrics and ideas about child rearing. I'm very interested in him as, the sort of the figure that raised the baby boomers. His book, Baby and Child Care, came out in 1946 at the beginning of the baby boom. And, thinking about, it's a generation that now is so vilified. And what are the kind of forces that have kind of led us to this place. I actually think he was in many ways ahead of his time, and a lot of what we're now seeing Biden talk about, are ideas that Dr. Spock had, and I'm very attracted to his view, the political part of him, which he really developed an idea in the 60s and 70s that parenting was not just the job of parents, but was really a shared responsibility of societies. And if kids didn't have anywhere to live and they didn't have food and they were being sent off to die in illegal wars, whether you get the dental checkup at 12 months or 18 months isn't really that important. So I'm starting to do research into him.
That is so interesting and nothing I would have imagined. So I'm glad I asked the question. And it reminds me that when my daughter was born in 1969, there was almost nothing I had to read about child rearing except Dr. Spock. And so I did, but I was not aware that he had ever trained as a psychoanalyst. And I'm happy to hear that looking back. And also that he had such a forward-looking understanding of the importance of child rearing, which our society kind of dismisses. It just pushes it off to the side. Somebody will do it, right? And mostly women.
Yeah.
Jumping forward, when I read D.W. Winnicott, I felt that he also had that perspective of the importance of the earliest years of life and how we attend to children. He didn't have the societal view that you're describing in Spock, I don't think, or at least I'm not aware of it, but he was looking at how we parent and not just how women parent, although he tended to focus on mothers because that task was assigned to women, as it still is today, and to mothers primarily. What more can you tell us about Spock and his relationship to psychoanalysis? Because when he trained, it must have been in a very traditional way. In other words, more Freudian than not, but so he didn't sound Freudian.
Yeah, he trained at the New York Psychoanalytic Institute. And he was, an admirer of Freud. He was very against any kind of language that wasn't rooted in, he liked very colloquial language. And so he doesn't sound like a Freudian when he speaks. But he really brought to pediatrics this idea, or helped bring to pediatrics this idea that, you know, that parents and societies needed to pay attention to the emotional, psychological needs of children and not only the medical needs. Mm-hmm. And, you know, in his practice early on, he observed that the questions that parents would come to him with were really not about, you know, traditional medicine. They were more about their kids' emotional development and emotional life. So he was a trailblazer in that way. And when, you know, I guess one publisher came to him when he was a few years, he had a practice in Manhattan, and a publisher wanted a book that would give parents advice that was rooted more in psychology. And so his name came up, and so they went to him, and he didn't have the confidence yet. So I need some more time. I'm not ready to write a book and give parents advice. So that publisher went away, and I'm sure they're not very happy now about that, because it's been the best-selling nonfiction book of all time, other than the Bible, if you consider the Bible nonfiction. So, you know, a few years later, another publisher came knocking, and this time he had more confidence, and he said yes. And that became, you know, Baby and Child Care, you know, which really was, you know, before there was this huge cottage industry of parenting books, which I think now is very overwhelming for parents. He became this very, you know, dominant voice in parenting, and kind of a Bible for parents.
That is so interesting. Is this likely to be a feature-length film? What are you thinking?
I am wanting it to be a feature-length film.
Terrific. I can't wait to see it.
No, it's really interesting. And, you know, he has a huge archive, and, you know, he marched with Martin Luther King, and he ran for president as a socialist. I mean, there's a whole side of him that I think a lot of people don't know about.
Oh, wonderful. I want to learn more about him myself.
Good.
I see that we're kind of nearing our time to segue into questions, but I thought I would just ask you one more. Is there something else about Hysterical Girl that you'd like to talk about that we haven't touched on yet?
I guess one other, there was something else that you said when we spoke, kind of just one-on-one at the APSA convention, and you described the case history, and I went back to that essay that you mentioned that you wrote, I guess in the 80s, where you described the case history itself as sort of structurally resembling an assault.
Goodness, yeah.
Yeah, and that is, you know, in the film, you know, the first time that Dora is assaulted, there's a scene where there's like some watercolor animation. She escapes the office and she runs away, and you see it in animation.
Yeah.
In black and white. And then that reappears at the end of the film when she finally quits treatment with Freud. You see that watercolor animation again. And in many ways, that's sort of a nod to your point of this, the sort of, you know, ascribing of like sexual desire to Dora by Freud. You know, you're describing that as an assault in its own way. I think I have the essay here. You said, because I loved it. We arrive at a view of this case history as an attempted seduction via interpretation. And so this sort of bookending of her running away from Herr K and then leaving Freud is kind of a nod to that.
Well, thank you for pointing that out to me and reminding me of what I said. I think what I was about to say before you quoted from me is that the case history as it is written, and all we have is what Freud wrote. We don't have the actual experience. We can't, it wasn't recorded. We can't go look at it. It's, So it's a construct, and that construct to me comes across as verbally coercive. That's how it reads to me. And he didn't leave her an out. You know, there wasn't, it seems as though he's boxing her in, even though he believes her story about the complexity and seaminess of her family's interactions with this friend, Herke, and his wife. He then turns it against her as if she should consent to this structure of relationship over which she has no control. And I was going to come back to the image of running that occurred to me as a very powerful part of your film. And you've already kind of explained how you wove it in. But the running imagery is, I think, says without words what the only avenue that was available to Dora in that circumstance, and still today, it's the only avenue we have often in coercive situations. And sometimes we don't even have that. It may, a bad situation may end up in rape. So many of, let's say, Harvey Weinstein's victims were able to walk out and close the door, but some of them could not. So I think the imagery of running and having it be artistic rather than you know, an image of a person running necessarily, but having that sequence of images of a young person running is just right for the film. And let's see, there was something else on my mind, but it's kind of flipped away. Probably come back later. Maybe it's time to turn back to Anne and listen to what our viewers have to say.
Well, yeah, it was a fascinating conversation. I have tons of notes, many lines of inquiry to follow after this. And we do have a few questions here. I'm going to actually ask mine so I can sneak that in. One of the currents that I was starting to hear emerge, Madeline, when you brought up activist Tarana Burke, who founded the Me Too movement, something that I consider often is how when doing psychoanalytic, historically oriented critique, issues around race and racism or ethnicity, class, or ability can still be part of the conversation, in that it's so often Black women identifying activists who are at the forefront of these movements, like the Me Too movement. So I don't know if either of you have thoughts about how that kind of work that's being done in the contemporary conversations can influence the way historical narratives are crafted.
That's a very condensed question and a very important one, and I don't think I can answer it in any kind of comprehensive way or way that is adequate to the question. But one of the things that does occur to me is that when the Me Too movement really took off, I was happy to have Tarana Burke come forward or be brought forward, mostly on TV programs I was watching, to be credited with having founded this movement, essentially, to have created this idea that other women could respond to. So, and her role had been partly obscured and hidden, but at least she was acknowledged at the time. And it made a big difference to me to have that phrase. It's like having the term sexual harassment allows you to talk about it. Having the term Me Too in a different era in which we're talking about Twitter which didn't exist when I was growing up, certainly, and even as a young woman. It allows us to acknowledge a part of our experience that we didn't have words for. And this is across the spectrum of race and class. Although I agree with you, those elements of our experience in society tend to be marginalized over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm. I would maybe just add that, Madeline, is it okay if I jump in?
Sure.
I just wanted to add that I think in thinking about, you know, issues that women face, it's, you know, it's not monolithic, and that Black women have, you know, a whole other set of experiences and, you know, negative tropes that they have to contend with. And sometimes when women get lumped together, that's what gets lost. And it's kind of like the white experience is the default experience.
Yeah, thank you. I guess that's exactly, I'm just thinking how can kind of a excavation of a case like this still be integrated into that work of not recreating that monolithic identity category, but it's a challenge, I suppose, of course. But, yeah. I can turn to other questions. We have a couple in the chat, which I might ask for folks to elaborate on by unmuting yourselves. The first is a bit of like an orienting question. The question is, were both Dora and Ada, is this, as I'm not a Freudian scholar, is this Ada or would it be Anna O possibly that is being referred to? Were they both assaulted is the question. And what exactly was Freud's fault? Ida, I see. Okay. Oh, I see. I think there's confusion around Dora and Ida.
Oh, okay.
And then maybe in more exploration of what Freud was complicit in the case history, which you were just touching on a little bit, Madeline.
Well, I have a couple of things to say off the top of my head. One is that to clarify the Dora-Ida confusion, Dora was the name that Freud chose to give to Ida Bauer, his actual patient, in an effort to conceal her actual identity and, quote, protect her from from unwanted attention. So Dora and Ida are the same person. And in fact, Ida is the real historical person and Dora is the invented name that Freud gave her. In terms of Freud's, quote, complicity, there is another element to the case history that is disturbing, and that is, along with persuading her or attempting to persuade her that she was in love with her father, with Herr K., with Frau K., he imagined that she had sexual feelings for him, for Freud himself. And he went to great lengths to describe a particular fantasy, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to many readers, in that he claimed that Ida's father was impotent. Now, how he may have known that is unclear, but he believed that to be true. So then the question was, what kind of sexual activity did Dora's father have with Frau K., the wife of Herr K.? So Freud assumed that it was oral sex. He did not pursue the question of what kind of gratification that would have given Frau K. He was oriented towards what kind of pleasure Ida's father might have. And then he imagined that Dora herself fantasized this kind of sexual activity, that that's what she desired. And that in particular, he went on at length to explain how this could be possible, tracing it back to her habit of, quote, masturbation, and also ultimately to the kind of pleasure that a child or an infant takes in nursing from its mother. So he had a big investment in this particular fantasy and attributing it to both Frau K and to Dora. And at some point he even says he imagined that Dora wished to have a kiss from him. And that's when it begins to feel really, really uncomfortable. And that's basically all I have to say about that.
Thank you. I will ask this next one. It's for Kate. Did you watch any of the other films about Dora? John Huston's, Anthony McCall's, Hugh Bordy's are the ones that are listed.
Yes, so I did, and the John Huston film used to open Hysterical Girl. It was Montgomery Clift as Freud, and there's sort of Montgomery Clift is a sort of tragic figure. He had a really difficult end of his life, and I thought that was kind of an interesting juxtaposition. But it used to begin and end with Montgomery Clift. And then I was like, why am I bookending a film about a woman with a man? So I didn't use it, but there is a clip of it in there, really, a very quick clip of it. And then there was also a really great art piece that was done. I think it was in the mid-70s that kind of it intercuts like a case, Freud and Dora together, and then porn, and then commercials. It's very different. It's like much slower, but that also was really interesting and inspirational, yeah.
So just to follow up on this question, they just influenced your thinking? They were part of your research? In what way did they shape it at all, what the film that you went on to create?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, they were, not all of them, but sort of part of the lionizing of Freud that I wanted the film to push back against. The John Huston film is the one I kind of like spent the most time with. So, they just feel very much like from his point of view. And so they kind of probably pushed me more in like the other direction.
Mm-hmm. So as a response.
Yeah.
Or not exclusively, yeah. And there's a final question, which I think since we're nearing our time here, might be a lovely one to end with, though I might ask Sayamak to elaborate. I'm not sure I quite understand. The question is, if you take a snapshot of today's presentation, in what film would you use? Sayamak, are you okay to unmute yourself and say a little bit more about your question?
Yes.
Okay.
I see filmmakers very similar to psychoanalysts, of course, as well as the writers, and they do write case histories. And in that sense, you may say it's assault on truth, but of course, the truth is always narrative rather than veridical. So it's not an assault, it's a construction. So again, you're talking about a different films and different area. I was just trying to see if I could listen to all this stuff on a couch. What would I say? What would I think about the present preoccupation? And I'm sure that the previous films pointed to different preoccupations. And today in psychoanalysis, we don't care that much about the history. Well, in fact, following the Freud history is a fantasy. But we want to see what are those fantasies or the histories are speaking about right now.
Do you mean in the sense that to look historically at Freud's work is in itself a fantasy? And certain fantasies are then projected forward in a film or a book.
So, yeah, in a sense, it speaks about today. So I was just wondering if you take a snapshot of the today's presentation, in what kind of film would you use that?
You mean the discussion today?
It feels to me a little bit like you're asking us to psychoanalyze ourselves, which I am not capable or prepared to do right now. I think this discussion is really about the present more than the past and where we go from here.
Yeah.
In other words, how do we take the Me Too movement and its achievements to move into another phase in terms of social awareness, in terms of how we view women and the stories they tell, instead of assuming up front that we're lying if we're saying something that's uncomfortable to others. And I'm not sure what the next step is, because I don't think we're there yet, but maybe Kate is better prepared to talk about this, because she's starting a very new project, which will have different kinds of repercussions than the ones that this film has had on its viewers. And I don't want to take up all the time that's remaining, but in my own writing life, what I find is that when I write something that has preoccupied me for a long time, it opens a door to another subject and to another line of thought, or even a way of being or phase in my life. So I think of writing as movement, and it wouldn't surprise me if visual artists have the same sense of how their work inspires them. When you finish one project, you suddenly see another one opening up before you. So I think it's Kate's turn to respond to this very complicated and challenging question.
Oh, it's a great question. So, okay, two things I guess come to mind. I always, I try sometimes to think about a contemporary film as a period piece in the future. Like, so in, 50 years, 100 years, if you watch this as a film, it would be a period piece. So I sort of think of it in that genre, also because we're kind of talking about being here in 2020 and thinking back to 1900. And so how is that kind of time progression going to continue? How will we look back on this past? I know that's not a specific film, but it's a genre. And then, maybe another genre that could potentially come to mind would be, Madelon, I didn't know the similarities between our stories that we sort of discovered in the beginning of this, sort of finding out, say, in a buddy film, two people are in a car together and they never really know why, and then they are, and they kind of figure it out when they're like, halfway there. So those would maybe be the two genres that I can think of.
Anyway, I really loved your film. It was fantastic. And in fact, recommended to a number of my students, and some of them are here.
Oh, great. Thank you. I'm glad.
In that sense. But of course, I was just feeling that this, if I were listening to it on the couch, I would get this feeling of boxed in, assaulted, annoyed, uncomfortable in my skin. I mean, that's what I'm getting.
Yeah, and I think you successfully convey that, Kate, in your film. So in some regards. And I also want to be respectful of everyone's time. So we will conclude. Thank you both so much. I'm so thrilled to have had you both in this conversation. And thank you everyone for attending. will be awaiting anxiously your next film, Kate. And Kate Holford, since this is recorded, it sounds like we'll be putting this on the Minnesota Psychoanalytic Society and Institute YouTube channel. So if you want to share with anyone who wasn't able to attend, we'll be putting it online in the next week or so, I would say. So thank you all very much. And we can do, I guess, silent applause.
Thank you.
So,
thank
the
you.
one drawback of Zoom. So
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
take care, everyone. Thank you for coming.